I have set down a great many things in my long life as a country physician, births and deaths, fevers and mendings, the small daily courages of ordinary people. But I have never set down the winter at Thornmere, and I find now in my old age that I cannot go to my grave without it. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes, and a man who has seen what I saw is obliged, I think, to leave a record so that it is not lost when I am. I was a young man then, or young enough, 36, newly settled as physician to the scattered parishes below the high moors, still proud of my black bag and my Edinburgh letters and my belief that I understood the world. I understood very little. That is the first thing the winter taught me. It began with a summons. A boy came down to my rooms in the village on a gray afternoon in the last week of the year, his pony blown and steaming, to say that Mrs. Down, the housekeeper up at the hall, had taken a bad turn with her chest, and would the doctor come. I did not want to go. There was a smell to the air that any more-bred man knows, a flat iron cold that presses on the back of the throat, and the sky over the fells had gone the color of a bruise. Snow was coming. Everyone in the dale knew it was coming. But a summons is a summons, and Mrs. Down had a bad chest. And so I saddled my mare and rode up the long climbing road to Thornmere Hall with my collar turned to my ears, and I did not know that I would not ride down again for 11 days. I should tell you what the hall was in those years, so that you understand what happened to it. Thornmere was the greatest house in that whole country of moor and stone, a vast gray pile flung up on a shoulder of the high fell, with 40 chimneys and 100 dark windows, and a park of black pines bent all one way by the wind. Once it had been a house of light. The old people in the village still spoke of it. The balls in the long gallery, the tenants feasted in the great hall at Christmas, the whole valley glittering up at the hall on winter nights as though a piece of the summer sky had come down to rest on the fell. There had been 2 young lords then, the 2 Thornmere brothers, Adrian and Lucian, and the country loved them both, the elder grave and the younger laughing, and neither of them yet touched by what was coming. Then there had been the accident. I had it only in pieces in those first days from the servants who would speak of it in whispers, for it was not a thing that was said aloud within those walls. Some 7 winters before I climbed that road, in a storm not unlike the one I was riding into, the 2 brothers had gone out together over the top road to a neighbor's, against all sense, in the teeth of a blizzard, and the road had taken the younger one. Their carriage had gone off the buried edge of the high pass in the white blindness, and when the elder brother crawled out of the wreck and dug through the drift with his bare hands until they bled, it was already too late. Lucian Thornmere died in his brother's arms in the snow, a mile from any door, while the storm screamed over them both. Adrian, Duke of Thornmere, had carried his brother's body down off the fell alone, and from that day the light in the great house had gone out. He shut it up, not all at once, but steadily, room by room, year by year, as a man might put out candles going to bed, until only a wing of it was lived in, and the long gallery was under Holland covers, and the great hall where the tenants had been feasted stood cold and dark with its hearth swept bare. He did not travel. He did not receive. He had never married, though he was a duke in his prime and might have had any woman in England, and it was said, the village said it, in the low voices people keep for such things, that he could not bear the sight of winter, that he would not so much as cross the yard when snow was falling, that the first white flake of the season would drive him indoors to sit before his fire with the shutters closed and a face like a shut door. They called him in the dale the Duke who feared the snow. They did not say it unkindly. They said it the way you speak of a man carrying a wound you would not wish on your worst enemy. That was the house I rode up to, with the storm at my back. I came into the yard as the first snow began, fine and dry and driven sideways, and a groom took my mare. And old Halloway the butler let me in at a side door. The great door was never opened now. And I was brought up through cold, shrouded passages, past furniture like sleeping ghosts under their covers, to the housekeeper's room, where Mrs. Down lay gray-faced and fighting for her breath. I will not weary you with the medicine. She had an inflammation of the lungs, and she was old, and it was bad. I bled her a little, which I would not do now, and I set up a steam of friar's balsam, and I sat with her, and I sent down word that the doctor would need to stay the night, for she could not be left. And while I sat there, listening to that poor woman's chest labor like a bellows with a hole in it, I heard the storm come down over Thornmere in earnest. You who have not lived on the high moors do not know what such a storm is. It is not weather. It is a living thing, a great white animal that comes up over the edge of the world and lies down on the house and means to have it. The wind did not gust. It stood, a solid roaring wall of it, hour on hour, so that the whole vast pile of the hall seemed to lean under the weight. The snow did not fall. It flew level past the black windows, so thick that when I held a candle to the glass I could see nothing at all, not the yard, not the pines, not my own reflection, only the white streaming dark. By the second morning the drifts were to the ground floor sills. By the third the road down to the village was gone, not blocked, gone, buried under 15 feet of driven snow in the cuttings, and no man living could have got a horse through it, or himself. We were sealed into that great cold house as into a tomb, all of us, and the storm settled in to stay. It was on the second day that I first truly saw Esther Crane, though I had seen her before without seeing her, which is a thing I am ashamed of now. She was the widow of a shepherd, Tom Crane, who had died of a fall 3 winters back, and she lived alone in a low stone cottage on the very edge of the estate, out where the walled fields give up and the open moor begins, and she kept a few sheep of her own on the Duke's Grace and did fine sewing for the neighboring farms and asked nothing of anyone. I had physicked her once, for a cut hand, and been paid in eggs and thought no more of her. She was perhaps 30. She was not a beauty in the way the word is used in drawing rooms. She had a plain, strong, sweet face, brown from the weather and steady gray eyes, and hands that had worked, and she wore always the same worn dark gown and a shawl that had been her mother's, and when she came into a room the great people of the world would not have turned to look at her. That was exactly her value, though none of us knew it yet. The great people of the world had never had to survive anything. She had come up to the hall the night the storm broke, on her own 2 feet through the first of the snow, for a plain and practical reason. Her cottage stood too far out and too low, and she had buried enough winters on that moor to know that this one would drown a lone woman in a small house. And so she had done the sensible thing and walked the 2 miles up to the great house to shelter with the servants she knew, before the road closed. She had come, that is, because she understood the winter, understood it as a thing to be reckoned with and outlasted and respected, not feared. And she had reckoned it exactly right, for the road closed behind her that same night and did not open again for 11 days. I remember the moment I truly saw her. It was the second morning, and the house was frightened. You would not think a house so grand could be frightened, but a house is only its people, and the people of Thornmere were afraid. They were town-bred servants, most of them brought up from the south in easier years, and they had never known a more storm, and now they were sealed in a cold, half-dead house with the wind screaming in the 40 chimneys and the food stores untended, and the master shut in his rooms and the housekeeper, the one person who ran the place, dying in her bed. The maids were weeping in corners. The footmen stood about useless. Old Halloway wrung his hands. The fires were going out because no one had thought to husband the fuel. The kitchen was in chaos because Mrs. Downe had kept everything in her head, and her head was full of fever. It was, in short, the beginning of a disaster, a great house full of soft people, cut off from the world, coming apart at the seams while the storm battered the walls. And I, the doctor, could do nothing about it, for I am no housekeeper and I had my patient to keep alive. And then the shepherd's widow put down her sewing and stood up and took the house in hand. I did not see her be asked to, no one asked her. She simply saw what was happening, saw it the way she must have seen 100 hard winters on that moor, as a problem to be got through, not a fate to be wept over. And she set about it, quietly, without fuss, with an authority that came from nowhere but her own good sense. She got the weeping maids on their feet and gave them work, which is the only cure for terror. She went down to the kitchens and took stock of the stores. There was food enough if it was managed, and she managed it, rationing the flour and the salt meat and the tea against a siege of unknown length. She organized the fuel, sent the footmen, who had never carried a scuttle in their lives, to bring coal and split logs, and showed them how to bank a fire so that it held through the night, and closed off room after cold room to save the warmth for the few where we would live. She set the still-room maid to making broth, gallons of it, for a cold house lives on broth. And she came up twice a day to help me nurse Mrs. Downe, with hands that were gentle and sure and unafraid of the ugly work of the sick-room. And she asked me sensible questions, and did exactly what I told her, and I found within a day that I could not have kept that poor woman alive without her. I have thought since that this is what the great world never understands about the small people it overlooks. It thinks their smallness is weakness. It is nothing of the kind. Esther Crane had buried a husband and kept herself alive alone on the edge of a killing moor for 3 years, and there was not one soft thing in her, nor one hard thing either. She was simply strong, the way a good beam is strong, without any fuss about it, and she carried that whole frightened house on her back through those 11 days and never once asked to be thanked. The Duke did not come out of his rooms for the first 3 days. I understood it even then, though I did not yet understand him. The storm was his terror made flesh. Every hour that it screamed over the house was an hour it was screaming, in his mind, over the high pass where his brother had died. Every drift that climbed the windows was the drift he had dug through with his bleeding hands. And so he shut himself in his fire-lit study with the shutters barred against the sight of the snow, and he did not come out, and the servants crept past his door, and the great house came apart, and its master sat alone in the dark with his ghost. It was Esther who brought him out. She did not mean to, I think. She was not a scheming woman. She had no more notion of managing a duke than of managing the king. It happened as the best things happen by accident on the 3rd night, and I was there to see it, and I will set it down exactly. We had a crisis with the fires. The great flue that fed the study and the rooms above had grown blocked with the driven snow packing into the chimney head, a thing that happens in such storms, and the study had begun to fill with smoke, and there was danger of it catching, and the frightened footman did not know what to do, and old Holloway came to fetch me because I was the only gentleman awake, and I came, and I did not know what to do either. And into this, the smoke, the useless men, the master shut in his room beyond the smoking hearth, came Esther Crane in her mother's shawl, roused from her sleep by the commotion, and she took one look and one breath, and she knew exactly what was wrong, for she had cleared 100 snow-choked flues in her little cottage, and she gave her orders in that quiet voice, and within the half-hour the fire was drawn and the smoke was gone and the danger was past. And the Duke had come out. He had come out because a woman he did not know was giving orders in his own smoke-filled house at midnight, and he stood in the doorway of his study in his shirt-sleeves with his dark hair wild and his face gaunt in the firelight, and he looked at her, this plain brown-faced widow in a borrowed shawl, kneeling at his hearth with soot on her hands, undoing in half an hour a disaster his whole household of trained servants could not manage, and I saw something move in that shut. Grief-frozen face that I do not think had moved in 7 years. He did not thank her. He was long past the ordinary courtesies. Grief had worn them off him. He only stood and looked, and said at last, in a low, harsh voice like a door that has not been opened in a long time, "Who are you?" And Esther Crane rose from his hearth and wiped her hands on her apron and looked the Duke of Thornmere full in the face, without fear and without insolence, and said, "I'm Crane's widow, from the low cottage, your grace. I came up out of the weather. I'll be gone the moment the road opens." "You will not," he said, and I do not think he knew he was going to say it until it was said. "You are keeping my house alive. Holloway tells me you will stay until it is over." "I meant to," she said simply. "It's not over yet." And that was all. She went back to her bed, and he went back to his fire, and I thought no more of it that night than that a strong woman had done a strong thing. But I have come to believe that the whole of what followed turned on that midnight, on a shuddered man seeing, for the first time in 7 years, someone standing up to the winter instead of being crushed by it. He had thought there were only 2 ways to meet the snow, to die in it, as his brother had, or to hide from it, as he did. And here was a poor widow who did neither. Here was a woman who simply faced it and outlasted it, and got everyone through, and asked no thanks, and expected no rescue, and did not think herself brave, and was braver than any man in that house, the Duke first of all. He came out after that, every day a little more. I watched it happen over those long white days, from my post at Mrs. Downs' bedside, in the strange suspended time of a house under siege. For that is what it was, a siege, with the winter for the enemy and the walls for our only friend, and all of us pressed close together in the few warm rooms while the great animal of the storm lay on the roof and would not lift. In such a time the ordinary distances between people fall away. A duke and a doctor and a shepherd's widow, thrown together in a fire-lit room with death outside the shutters, become simply 3 people keeping each other alive. And I saw the Duke of Thornmere, who had not spoken a warm word to a living soul in 7 years, learn again how to be among the living, and I saw who taught him. It was Esther always. He gravitated to her the way a cold man gravitates to a fire, without meaning to, without knowing he did it. He would come into the kitchen where she was managing the stores, on some invented errand, and stand about, and end by carrying coal for her like a footman, this proud, grave Duke, because she needed coal carried and he could not think how to be near her otherwise. He would find her nursing Mrs. Down and sit down across the bed and take a turn at the steam kettle. In the long evenings, when the work was done and we gathered close about the one great fire in the small parlor that was all we now heated, the doctor, the widow, the housekeeper mending in her bed through the open door, old Halloway nodding, and the Duke, he would draw his chair a little nearer to hers each night, and listen while she talked, and slowly begin to talk himself. I heard in those evenings things I do not think that man had ever said aloud. He told her about his brother, not all at once and not as a confession. She never asked him for it, never pried, only sat with her sewing and let the silence be safe. But in pieces, over the long nights, the whole of it came out. How they had been boys together in that great house when it was full of light. How Lucien had been the laughing one, the beloved one, the one everybody's eye went to, and how Adrian had loved him without a shred of envy, had been glad to be the grave one in his bright brother's shadow. How the two of them had gone over the top road that last day against every warning. For some small, foolish reason, a party a girl Lucien was courting, nothing worth a life. And how the storm had come down, and the road had gone, and the carriage with it. And how Adrian had come to in the wreck with the snow already burying them, and had dug and got to his brother, and held him. And how Lucien had died there in his arms in the white, roaring dark, quite calmly at the end. Saying it was all right, saying it was not Adrian's fault, which had, of course, made it 1,000 times worse. He forgave me, the Duke said one night, staring into the fire, for the thing I could never forgive myself. He used his last breath on it, and I have spent 7 years proving him wrong. I shut the house he loved. I put out every light he ever laughed under. I have not let the snow so much as touch my face since the day it took him, because, and hear his harsh voice crack just once like ice on a pond, because if I go out into it, if I let it near me, then it is real, then he is truly gone, and I have kept him not gone by refusing the winter that took him. Do you see? It is madness. I know it is madness. I have known it for 7 years and been unable to stop. And I held my breath in my corner, waiting to hear what a wise man would say to such grief, and Esther Crane said nothing wise at all. She set down her sewing, and she looked at him with those steady gray eyes, and she said, "My Tom died on a fine spring morning. Fell off a wall he'd mended 100 times. There was primroses out." She was quiet a moment. "I couldn't look at a primrose for a year, tore them all up out of my own garden. And then one spring I was too tired to tear them up, and they came up anyway, all yellow, not caring, and I sat down in the middle of them and cried till I was sick. And then," she spread her worn hands, "then it was better, not mended, better. The primroses never did him any harm, your grace. They were only doing what primroses do. It was me making them into knives." The Duke looked at her for a long time. "You are saying the snow is not my enemy," he said. "I'm saying it's not anybody's friend nor anybody's enemy," said Esther. "It's just the snow. It killed my sheep last year, and it'll feed my grass come spring. It took your brother because he was in the wrong place in it. God rest him, and that's a grief that'll never leave you and shouldn't. But it's not out there hunting you, your grace. It's just falling. All this 7 years, you've been fighting a thing that isn't fighting back. I have physicked the human heart in my long way more than any organ of the body, and I tell you that in 30 years of practice I never heard it said better, nor saw a wound better dressed, than by that shepherd's widow in that firelit room, with her mother's shawl about her shoulders and her plain, brown face turned to a grieving man. She did not pity him. Pity would have insulted him. She simply told him the truth, as one who had earned the right to tell it, having survived her own, and I saw the Duke of Thornmere receive it, and hold it and begin, for the first time in 7 years, to set his terrible burden down. That was the 7th night. On the 8th, the girl he had become began to love the woman who had taught him, though he did not call it that, and would not for some while yet, and I dare say it was as strange and frightening to him as the snow. But I saw it. A doctor's trade is watching, and I watched the shut-up man come alive in the light of that quiet woman, and I watched him look at her when she did not see, with a face that had forgotten it could ache with anything but grief, and now ached with hope instead. He was falling in love, this feared and frozen Duke, with a poor shepherd's widow who owned nothing in the world but a shawl and a few sheep and more courage than all the great houses of England put together. And if there had been any justice in the ordinary run of things, the storm would have blown itself out then, and the road would have opened, and he would have found some gentle stumbling way to tell her, and it would all have come right quietly in the thaw. But the winter was not done with us. It had one more night to give, and it was the worst of all, and it is for that night, truly, that I have written all the rest. It was the 9th day, and the storm, which had lain on us so long, seemed at last to be lifting. The wind had dropped in the afternoon, and a hard blue cold had come, and we had all felt the loosening of the siege. and there had been something like cheerfulness at the fire. And then, near dark, young Jem, the stable lad, came running in white-faced from the yard to say that old Silas was not come home. I must tell you who Silas was. He was the oldest shepherd on the estate, a man near 70, half-blind and stubborn as the stone, who kept a flock in a fold 2 miles out along the open moor, and had a shepherd's hut out there where he would shelter in bad weather. He had been out at that fold when the storm broke, and no one had thought of him in the days since, for a shepherd in a storm keeps to his hut and his flock, and is safer there than anyone. Everyone assumed old Silas snug in his hut with his fire and his sheep, waiting out the weather like the moor man he was. But now Jem had been up to the high paddock in the loosening cold, and had seen, far out across the white waste toward the fold, a dark speck moving, a man, floundering, fallen, moving, and then not moving. And he had known it for Silas, out in the open, down in the drifts, 2 miles from any door, with the dark coming and the cold turning killing hard. The old man had left his hut. God knows why, to save a straggling ewe, most like, for that was Silas. And the storm had turned him about in the white blindness, as it turns the wisest, and he had wandered and gone down, and now he lay out on the open moor in the falling dark with the temperature dropping like a stone, and if no one went to him, he would be dead by morning. It was as simple and as terrible as that. And there was no one to go. Understand the whole of it. The able men of that house were 3 soft footmen and a stable lad and an old butler, none of whom had ever crossed a moor in their lives, let alone a moor buried under 9 days of storm snow in the killing cold of a clearing night, in the dark, 2 miles out and 2 miles back. To send them would be to send more men to die. I myself, a middling horseman and no more man, would have been dead in the first drift. And the Duke stood among us white to the lips, and I saw the old terror rise up in him and close his throat. For it was the snow, it was the very snow. It was a man dying out in the winter dark exactly as his brother had died. And the whole frozen horror of 7 years came down on him at once, and I saw that he could not move, could not speak, could not go and could not bear not to go, and stood there strangling on his own old grief while an old man died. It was Esther who moved. She had already risen. She was already at the pegs by the door, pulling on Tom's old coat that she had brought up with her, and his old boots, and winding a muffler round her throat, and I understood with a cold drop of the heart what she meant to do. "You cannot," I said. I took her arm. "Esther, it is 2 miles, it is dark. It is going down to a cold that kills. You will not come back." She looked at me, and there was no bravado in her face, no heroics, nothing but the plain, grave reckoning of a woman who has weighed a thing and made up her mind. "I know that moor blind, doctor," she said. "I've fetched sheep off it in worse than this. I've a chance if I go now and go straight. Silas has none if nobody goes." She freed her arm gently. "He carried me on his shoulders when I was a child. He gave the address at my Tom's grave. I'll not sit by a fire and let him die 2 miles off because it's cold." She was tying the muffler as she spoke, quite calm. "It's only the snow," she said. "It's not anybody's enemy, it's just falling." And she said it to me, but she looked as she said it at the Duke. Then she took a lantern, and old Silas's boy's word of where the speck had been, and she opened the door on the blue killing dark and the white waste, and she walked out into the winter to save a dying man, and the door swung shut behind her, and she was gone. I will tell you what happened in that room, in the hour that followed, because it is the truest thing I know about the human heart. The Duke of Thornmere stood where he was by the cold hearth of his own courage, and he did not move, and he did not speak, and the terror was on him like a hand round the throat. And we waited, and the dark came down full, and the cold outside deepened until we could feel it through the walls, a still, black, star-hung, murdering cold, the cold that comes when a storm clears and the heat runs up out of the world into the empty sky. And somewhere out in that cold, 2 people now were dying, the old man in the drifts, and the woman who had gone to him, and here in the warm room stood a duke who could save them, who knew that moor as well as she did, who was the strongest man among us, and who could not move for the old ghost that had frozen him 7 years. I did not reproach him. God forgive me, I understood him too well. I only sat and prayed and watched the door and watched him, and knew that a good woman was dying 2 miles off, and that the man who loved her was too broken by grief to go to her, and that this was the most terrible thing I had ever seen. And then the Duke of Thornmere did the bravest thing I have ever watched a man do. He did not do it in a rush with a cry and a passion. That would have been easy. Passion is easy. He did it slowly, in the cold, clear terror of a man walking to his own execution, in full knowledge of exactly what waited for him out there. I saw it happen in his face. I saw the moment the love in him grew at last, heavier than the fear, not louder, heavier, the way a slow tide grows heavier than a stone until the stone must move. I saw him look at the door she had gone out of. I saw him look at the shutters he had barred against the snow for 7 years. And I saw him cross the room, this shattered, frozen man, and take down a coat, and take a lantern, and begin, with hands that shook, to make himself ready to walk into the one thing on earth he could not face. "Your Grace," old Holloway quavered, "you cannot, you'll—" "I have hidden from this for 7 years," said the Duke. His voice was very quiet and very steady, though his hands shook. "I hid while my brother died, and then I hid from the snow that took him, and I called it grief, but it was cowardice, and I have let it cost me everything I ever loved." He wound the muffler round his throat. He looked at me, and I have never forgotten his eyes. "I will not hide while she dies too. If the winter wants a Thornmere, it may come and take this one, but it will not have her. Not while I can stand." And Adrian, Duke of Thornmere, the Duke who feared the snow, opened his own barred door with his own hand and walked out into the killing dark after the woman he loved, into the very winter that had broken his heart and his life. And the cold swallowed him, and the door swung shut, and there was nothing left for the rest of us to do but keep the fires roaring and the broth hot and pray to a God who did not seem, that night, to be much minded of the high moors. I will not pretend I know all of what passed out there in the dark, for I was not out there. I was in the warm room, keeping the death watch by the window, useless as a doctor is always useless against the truly great things. But I had it after from them both in pieces over the years, for they lived, oh, they lived, or I should not be writing this. And I can set down what happened on the moor that night, and I will, for it is the heart of the whole matter. He found her by her lantern. She had got to Selah's, that was the wonder of it, the sheer impossible courage of it. She had crossed the 2 miles of buried moor in the dark, straight, by some sense in her feet that only the moor-bred have, and she had found the old man down and half frozen in a drift by the broken fold, and she had got him up, and got her shoulder under him, and started him back, an old heavy failing man leaning his whole weight on a woman half his size, one dragging step at a time across the murdering waste. She had got him nearly a mile, and then within sight of the high paddock wall, within a half-mile of the warm house and the saving fire, her own strength had at last run out, for no strength is bottomless, not even hers, and she had gone down in the deep drift by the wall with the old man in her arms, gone down into the soft, killing cold that feels at the end, so warm, and she could not rise, and the snow had begun, gently, to take them both. And that is where the Duke found them. That is where the Duke who feared the snow, floundering out of the dark with his lantern and his shaking hands and his heart in his mouth, came at last upon the woman he loved, down in the very drift, dying in the very winter, holding a dying man exactly as he had once held his dying brother. The whole horror of his life laid out before him again in the snow, the thing he had barred his doors against for 7 years, come round at last to meet him face to face. And this time he did not fail it. This time he did not crawl out of the wreck too late. This time he was not too late at all. He fell on his knees in the drift beside her, and he dug with his bare hands. As he had dug for his brother, the same hands, the same snow, the same white roaring dark, but a different end, God be thanked, a different end. He dug her out, and the old man with her, and he got her up against his chest. And her eyes came open just, and she knew him, and she said, she told me this herself, years after, with tears standing in her eyes to remember it, she said, "You came out." Only that. "You came out." "I came out," said the Duke. And he wept, kneeling in the snow that had taken everything from him and given, at the last, this back. He wept and gathered her up, and got the old shepherd's arm over his own shoulder, and somehow, I do not know how, no man knows how, love does such things and does not explain them. Somehow that one broken man carried and dragged and hauled the two of them the last half-mile through the killing cold to the paddock wall, and along it, and to the yard, and to the door, and fell through it into the light and the warmth with the woman in his arms and the old man at his side. All 3 of them white as the dead, and none of them dead, and the winter shut out behind him at last, forever beaten. I was ready. God be thanked, I was ready, for I had known it must come to the sick room or the grave. We had the fires banked high and the beds warmed and the broth scalding, and I worked over the 3 of them that night as I have never worked before or since, the slow, terrible, careful work of bringing the frozen back from the very edge, the warming that must be done gently or it kills, the watching, the chafing, the hour on hour by the fire. Old Selah's came round by midnight, tough as a thorn root, and lived another 5 years to be a plague to everyone. Esther was longer. Esther had spent everything she had out on that moor, and for a while in the small hours I was not sure, I will be honest. I was not sure I could bring her back, and I saw the Duke's face as he watched, and I have never seen such a thing on a human face, all the 7 years of grief and the one night's hope hanging together in the balance, and I worked the harder for it. But she was strong. I have told you she was strong, strong the way a good beam is strong. Near dawn she came back to us, her breath deepened, and the gray left her lips, and the terrible waxen stillness went out of her face, and the sleep in it became an ordinary sleep, and I straightened up from her bed with my back breaking and my eyes stinging, and I said to the Duke, "She will live. She will do well. Let her sleep." And the Duke of Thornmere, who had not wept in 7 years until that night, and had wept twice in it, sat down by the bed of the shepherd's widow, and took her worn hand in both of his, and bowed his head over it, and did not let it go, and was still holding it, fast asleep in his chair from sheer spent exhaustion, when the sun came up. I remember that sunrise. I will remember it when I remember nothing else. For the storm had blown itself out in the night, wholly out, and the morning came up over the high moors in a still and blinding glory, a white unbroken world under a sky of hard, clean blue, and the first low sun struck across the drifts and set the whole vast, dazzling waste alight, mile on mile of it, sparkling, silent, and utterly beautiful. The same snow, the very same snow, that had been for 7 years the face of everything that man most feared. And it came in through the window he had unbarred and fell across the two of them, the sleeping woman and the man who had gone into the winter for her, and it did them no harm at all. It was only the snow. It was just falling. And it had never in all those years been his enemy. And now, in the plain light of that morning, with her hand in his, he need never fear it again. The road opened 2 days later. I rode down at last to my neglected practice, 11 days after I had ridden up, a changed man, though I could not then have said how. And I left behind me a house that was already, in some deep way, no longer the house I had come to, for the shutters were coming down. I saw it as I rode out, Halloway and the footman going room by room through that great dead pile, opening the barred shutters one after another, letting the winter light come flooding into chambers that had stood dark for 7 years, and the Duke of Thornmere walking among them in the sudden brightness with a face I would not have known. A living face, a man's face, tired and worn and cracked wide open and alive. I will not draw out the rest, for you have guessed it, and it needs no telling at length. He married her, of course. Not that spring, he was too wise, and so was she, to snatch at a thing born in a siege. He courted her honestly, through the year, walking down to the low cottage on the moor's edge in all weathers to sit at her plain fire and be an ordinary man, and letting the whole astonished country talk, and not caring one straw for the talk. A shepherd's widow. A duke. The Dale said it could not be, said it would not do, said 1,000 foolish things. And the Duke of Thornmere looked through every one of them as though they were made of the same air as the snow, and married Esther Crane in the little gray church in the valley on a fine day the following autumn, with old Sela's giving her away and half the moor come down to see it, and made her his duchess before God and the county, and never, to the end of his days, regretted a single hour of it. I was there. I danced at the wedding badly, for I am no dancer, but a man dances at such a wedding whether he can or no. And I saw the great hall of Thornmere lit up that night for the first time in 7 years, blazing every chandelier of it, the tenants feasted, and the fires roaring, and the long gallery thrown open, and the music going up into the winter dark, and the whole valley glittering up at the hall as the old people had told me it used to, as though a piece of the summer sky had come down again to rest on the fell. He had put the lights back on. She had taught him how. They were happy. I say it plainly, as their doctor and their friend for all the long years after, having watched over the births of their children in those once shuttered rooms and the small daily courages of their long life together. They were happy, deeply and quietly, and to the end. She never grew grand. She kept her mother's shawl in a drawer and her few sheep on the hill and her plain good sense about her to her dying day. And she ran that great house as she had run it through the siege, with a steady, ungrudging hand, and the servants would have gone into fire for her, and the tenants blessed her. And the Duke looked at her, across all the years, with the face of a man who has been dead and been given his life back and knows to the last hour exactly what it is worth. I am very old now, and they are both long gone, lying side by side in the little gray churchyard down the valley under a stone that says only their names and the years. And I shall be laid not far from them before this winter is out, I think. by the feel of my chest and the look of the sky. And I find I am not afraid, for I have seen what I have seen. I have seen the snow that took everything from a man give it in the end all back. I have seen a poor widow that the world would not turn its head to look at walk into a killing winter to save a dying man, and I have seen a great duke walk out after her into the one terror he could not face, because he loved her, and love in the end is heavier than fear, heavier than grief, heavier even than the deep drifts of the high moors. It is snowing tonight, as I set down the last of this, the first snow of the year, coming down soft past my window into the dark. Once I would have shivered at it, remembering. Now I only watch it fall and think of the two of them and of that white blazing morning long ago, and I am not afraid. It is only the snow. It is just falling, and it was never anybody's enemy at all.